selling. A very quick example of that is the huge influence that programs like Dragon's Den and particularly The Apprentice have on how we sell. Lots of people, when you ask them, will say that those programs present a style of selling that they'd be very uncomfortable with, and yet when you ask them about their own kind of guilt and perceptions of sales and selling, lots of things they feel guilty about not doing are the very same things that they've said they think probably wouldn't work. Just to illustrate this, one of the questions that I often ask groups, and I'll ask you to think about it, though I know you can't respond, is what do people do when they're lying? And when I ask that of groups, I tend to get a fairly consistent set of responses. So what people will tell me is that when people are lying, they might avoid eye contact, they may look up and left or up and right, depending on which one people have learnt. They'll probably shuffle a bit, get a bit shifty in their body language, and they may touch their face, rub their nose, any of these other sort of body language tells. And that's what most groups will tell me if I ask that question. And that is the perfect answer to the question, what did people do when they were lying in the 70s? Because the research that told us all these things was done that long ago. And because I can ask most groups of people and get fairly consistent responses, what I'm actually hearing back from people is a really handy list of the things that people know not to do when they're lying. So if we look at what the most recent evidence says about lying, what we'll see is that people who are in high-stakes situation where they need not to get caught will actually do the opposite of those things. So their level of movement and body language altogether will be extremely low. They'll actually be much stiller than they would be otherwise. And they tend to make very prolonged eye contact, longer than you'd expect in normal conversation. And that's an indication of what happens when the research, you'll get to understand it. What they're selling is that we tend to think of it as technique based, and we tend to overestimate how good we are at getting away with it. So the main message I would have for anybody is any time you're thinking of using a technique or a trick or a proven methodology for sales, you're probably underestimating the intelligence of your customer. And that's a problem because most of us really dislike being sold to. And as soon as we detect that that's what somebody is doing, it damages our trust in that person. So the trick really is to think very differently about how we approach interactions with customers, and we'll look a bit more at that later on. We'll also look at some of the things that have been proven to be very, very effective for how people buy now. Let's start with one of those straight away. One of the things that we know about selling is it's very, very important that your message is grabbable. We refer to that as making it a can of beans. So when you see that can of beans there, most of you will recognise it to some degree, and a lot of you, if I asked you what was in it, would be able to give me a fairly detailed description of what's in that can, the colour, the size of beans, that sort of things. And you get all that just from one look at it. So nobody from Heinz has to come and tell you all that stuff. You've learned that through your experience. And that experience allows you to recognize that out instantly and tell somebody else about it. Some of you may have heard of the parable of the grains of rice. It's a very, very ancient parable, and the theory is, well, the parable is, that the inventor of the game of chess went to the ruler of his land and said, I've invented this great game, you're going to love it. And he taught the ruler of the land how to play it, and he got completely hooked, and then they taught other people to play it, and soon all of the court were playing chess and nobody was doing any real work. And the ruler of the land said to the inventor, this is amazing, what would you like for compensation? And the inventor said, pay me in rice. Give me 1 grain of rice for the first square of the chessboard, 2 for the second, double it to 4 for the next, and so on. And that was how he was to be paid. Now, it's very simple to see that that is a parable about exponential growth. If I asked you to guess the number of grains of rice that would be by the 64th or last square of the chessboard, some of you may be very, very good at maths and know. For the rest of you, this is a number. It's a really big number. In fact, I am reliably informed that that is more grains of rice than there are in the world, and in fact more grains of rice than there have ever been in the world. Now, I'm not a mathematician, so I'm taking that on trust, but you can see how this theory of exponential growth works. In order to tap into this for your business, you have to have a message that is really easy for people to pass on, and there are 2 main components to that. The first one is that it has to be grabbable like the can of beans. So you need to be able to make it concise, make people understand it, and make it something that they'll be very confident to tell somebody else about. And that is very hard to achieve for lots of businesses. It's particularly hard for social businesses because we want to encapsulate not just what we do, but why we do it and the impact of that. But it's vitally important to do and to keep working at and refining it. The second thing that your message has to have is something that makes people want to pass it on. And all of the research that we've seen recently suggests that the main driver for that in this very, very crowded marketplace is distinctiveness. So it has to be something that hasn't been heard before, or where it's different enough that they're motivated to tell people about it. We'll move on to talk a little bit more about the distinctions of it in a second. On the making it kind of grabbable and passable, there is no substitute for testing that repeatedly with people that you know and people that you don't know, and it's one of the reasons why networking is really important. In general, we tend to overestimate how good we are at both things. We've got a tendency to assume that people know quite a lot more of the stuff that's in our head than they actually do, and that means that when we give people a concise version of what we do, we sometimes miss out the important bits because we assume they know it. The way to check if doing that is to test it, and test it with lots of people, and check what they've understood from what you've said. You will have access to a pen and paper nearby, or that you can type something on your computer screen quite quickly. So very simply, what I'd like you to do for you to write down 5 words that make you different. Your USPs, things that make you really exciting and distinctive. 5 single words in that. Some people that'll be really easy. For other people that'll take a little bit longer. So I'm going to give you a whole minute to do that. Because it feels quite odd to sit in silence for that long, I will keep talking a little bit for this last bit. If you are really, really struggling to come up with 5 words, come up with 3, or the closest you can get to, because I recognise that for some businesses this is really, really tricky. I also know that for some of you, it won't be that each of the words stands on their own right, so it might be that what makes you different is the combination of 2 of your differentiators, and that's absolutely fine. Okay, I'm going to hope that you've got your words or thereabouts, and then I'm going to trust your honesty. What I'm going to show you is a list of words, and I want you to be really brutal with yourself. If any one of the words you've written down is either one of the words on this list or is a variation on one of the words in these lists, I want you to be out. So in effect, that would mean that in terms of the distinctiveness test, you've still got a little bit more work to do. Just to let you know, I do this experiment a lot with people, and in general, most people don't pass this test. And I do that not to criticize people, but because if you can create messages that pass this test, they are incredibly powerful for selling what you do and getting people to talk about you. Here's the list. Oh, no, that's not the list. Here's the list. If you've written any version of any of these words, even for one of them, or a word that's close or means the same as any of these, then your message may not be distinctive enough. The purpose of differentiators when we're creating distinctive messages is to allow somebody to make a choice between you and another organisation. And increasingly in the market we work with, people have more and more choices. So it's less likely that they're choosing between you and doing nothing. That means that your differentiators have to really choose between you and your nearest competitor. Now, I often get businesses who will say, well, we don't really have a competitor, we don't have a competitor in our area. And that's sometimes true, but what is more common is that you have a number of people who overlap with you in different areas of service. So we want a Venn diagram that nobody has the same even if that's not true, you may find that you're competing for funding with other organisations. Sometimes it's bonuses and things, but you still have access to money. Way to decide if one of your messages is a differentiator is to picture yourself in a room full of your competitors, and they're all going to stand up and introduce themselves. And unless one of them is going to stand up and seriously and credibly tell people that they are the opposite of one of the things on your list, it's not really a differentiator. So if we take the first one on my list in front of you, professional, which is one that people use a lot, if somebody's giving you money for what you do in any form, then I have an expectation that you're going to be professional. I also think you'll struggle to find a single one of your competitors who describe themselves as unprofessional. And yet, we often use words like this to describe our services. Words that even if we know for a fact our competitors don't do it very well, we can also be fairly confident that if they were asked whether they were that, they'd still say yes. So if professional doesn't work, we need to find some words that do. One word that for some people is a differentiator is corporate. So in my field, my training tends to be quite non-corporate. It doesn't mean I don't work with corporates, but it often means that when I do, they've chosen me because our style and approach is distinctly different from theirs. If I'm a professional, I'd be offended. But if somebody described us as non-corporate, I'd understand what they meant, and I'd probably. When you have the words, the 5 words that you put together earlier, try writing the opposite of them down next to them and see if it's a real differentiator, if any of your clients describe themselves in that way. And if you aren't quite there, 5 words that do that would be my main recommendation from today. Work on that list and find really, really distinctive differentiators. We see really impressive results from people when they get this right, because it helps people understand whether to go with them, whether to go with someone else, and what they're getting when they make that decision. One of the difficulties about working with data is that when we know what works on average, it's really easy to think that that will work for everyone. And of course that's not true. The problem is that most of us don't keep very good data about what does work and what doesn't. If you want to improve the way in which you sell, most organisations benefit from keeping much, much better records of what they're doing and what works. For lots of small organisations, when we look at what we actually control in our business, it's really just two main things. We control the money that we spend on things and the time that we spend on them. And yet, most of us don't keep timesheets. And when we do, we tend to focus on collating the time we spend with paying clients, not analysing the time we spend getting paying clients. If you're in the situation where your two main controllables are time and money, it's well worth recording how you use those things for a period of time. Now, I know realistically most of us wouldn't complete a timesheet every day forever. So one of the things we suggest people try is to choose 2 months of the year that are relatively normal for your line of work and just record those and analyse them. So in my business, we record February and September, outside the holiday season for clients, a time when we know that work tends to be as close to normal as it ever gets for us. There are loads of really good free tools for measuring your time. If you type in best free timesheet applications into Google, you should come up with some really good ones. And there's also lots of free apps for your phone if you've got an apps-based phone. When you have the data, you then need to analyse it. Collecting it isn't enough. And one of the things that you need to look at is how the activity that you undertake to bring income in whichever form income is for you, how it converts into two main things. How profitable is it? Now, I know that's not about distributed profits for lots of us, but are we making the right decisions about the stuff that gives us that maximum amount of wriggle room in our business? And secondly, how closely does that income generation activity match our social goals? What you can sometimes find is that we're really good at achieving one without the other. And when we know we're doing that, that might still be the choice that we make, but very often we're making that choice unconsciously without having data in front of us. We often work with organisations who know exactly what brings in the most of their income, and so they focus on that activity. But what they don't know is that other things they're doing less of bring in income which is much better for the organisation. So income that either has a bigger impact on reducing overheads or produces more profit, or income which achieves the social outcomes that you're seeking much, much faster. So those are things to look for when you collect your data. Most organisations will buck the trend sometimes. So whilst it's brilliant to know in general what works, it's much better to know what works for you, for your team and for your organisation. Okay, we talk about sales but for human. And this is the idea that techniques and strategies won't necessarily work. You need to have real human interactions. And that means thinking about sales very differently than some of the perceptions we have about what it feels like to be sold to badly. Part of that is understanding that being sold to makes our customers anxious as well as making us feel uncomfortable. So if you create a sales setting where you're nervous, you increase the anxiety in the person you're talking to, and that will colour their reactions. That can mean that sometimes the feedback we get in those sessions or the responses we get are a result of that anxiety, not of the effectiveness of our message. So the less salesy you are and the more comfortable you are, the more true data you'll get from your interactions. It doesn't mean necessarily more people will say yes, but you're much more likely to get the reason why someone said no, and that is really valuable information. The biggest changes that we see in how people have to sell now versus some of the kind of sales mythology from the past is that we've traditionally often thought of sales as kind of adversarial, and lots of the terminology around it is like that. We talk about winning sales, we talk about battling objections, and overall all of the language is quite testosterone-y and macho. The reality is nowadays, if you want to increase the impact you have in your market, you need to spend less time worrying about converting customers to your way of thinking, convincing them or winning them over, and far more time understanding who your customers will be and then finding them. When you focus on finding people who need your service and who can afford to pay for it, then your sales effort becomes much, much less strenuous because you're talking to the right audience. And the emphasis on kind of converting people then goes completely. You find the people who want what you have. And it's a great way of doing it, because if you can't find people who want what you have, then you know that the problem is to go back to what you have and make sure the product and the model and the pricing are right for your audience. The second thing that we see from businesses is that by far the most common mistake organisations make when it comes to income generation is that they just don't do enough of it. It's not a priority, it's not something that people enjoy, and therefore the pressure to do it is always too high to make it fun. So if it's the thing that you feel a little bit sick in your stomach about, if it's the thing that makes you feel icky and nervous, or if it's the thing that you always put off, then you're never going to get the results from it that you'd really like to see. Increasing the ways in which you talk to people, increasing your interaction with people will, for most organisations, reap benefits relatively quickly. But that means you have to invest time in it and take it seriously. And realistically, you probably need to talk a lot more and in more ways. So if you're not networking, start networking. If you don't do public speaking, consider starting that. If you don't engage on Twitter, think about whether that should be part of your mix, or Facebook, or LinkedIn. You have to choose the right mix for you and your brand, and you have to choose a mix that you know you can commit to, because starting one and letting it drop off won't be great. But have a real serious think about whether you are doing enough of the right kind of things to get the returns that you need to grow and thrive. Because for a lot of organisations, it's that simple. There just isn't enough activity going in to get the results that are required. The final issue with sales is one that applies far, far more to those of us who have started an organisation that we love, that's driven by a real passion, that's about something that's important to us. Because when you sell under those circumstances, the rejections we get hurt. They're like a series of I don't love yous, and they really will affect our confidence. There are a few things that we need to do, or that we can do, that can mediate this, but we can never take it away completely. So there's always going to be days where we hear too many no's and want to drink wine and eat biscuits and curl up in the corner, but we have to have strategies that keep us going when that happens. The first strategy that we recommend is just to keep connected to why you do it. If what you do is important, and I'm sure it is, keep reminding yourself of that, because for lots of us, the importance of what we do, the impact that it has, and the difference that we make are what get us through the bad days. The second thing that we can do to protect ourselves is to get really real about the response rates we can expect from different activity. So to give an example, let's just say you were going to do the dreaded picking up the telephone to try and get meetings. If you outsource that activity to a professional appointment setting agency, and they were going to do it for a whole day, do you have an idea of how many phone numbers you'd expect to give them for a whole day of calling? The reality is that most professional agencies are going to ask you for between 50 to 70 phone numbers. And they're going to try, in a full day of calling, to have about 40 conversations on average. So you've given them the numbers, they've had their 40 conversations, you've paid them a great big wodge of your hard-earned money. How many appointments are you looking for from that investment? For lots of us, looking at it on average across professional appointment settings, a fantastic result from that full day of activity, those 40 conversations, is between 1 and 3 appointments. And that can feel pretty depressing, But if those appointments, some of them convert into new opportunities in sales, if those are the appointments with the right people, and if what we're selling is worth the effort, using the phone to get appointments is still one of the most effective ways to generate income. That means that at the start of the day of calling, we need to know what a great result is. Because if we don't set that expectation with ourselves, those 37 odd no's that we're going to get are really, really going to hurt. And we're probably not going to celebrate the 3 yeses that we get along the way, even when those 3 yeses put us on a par with professional appointment setters. The same is true of email marketing, of using the website, of Twitter, of all of these different mediums, even of face-to-face meetings and networking. Do some research about what kind of returns you can realistically expect, and don't start the process of beating yourself up until you actually know you're not doing well. It can be very, very easy to internalize all of this stuff as being about us and our ability, rather than being about the return on averages. What we see time and time again is that people selling for their own business that they're passionate about, for an organisation that they really believe in, actually blow those statistics out of the water, and most people are far more effective than the professional agencies that do this for us. But we don't know that, and what we hear of the no's, and we let that affect our willingness to pick the phone up the next day. We've talked a little bit earlier about making messages powerful. There's been some great research recently about what makes messages really, really effective. So this research was looking specifically actually at networking. So that awful bit when they say to everybody, stand up, tell people who you are and what you do. In lots of kind of formal networking settings, that's a 40 seconds or 60-second slot. And it's your chance really to impress people. It's also an explicit sales opportunity. So people are expecting you to tell them stuff in that gap that's going to impress them. It's going to make them make a decision about whether they want to know more, whether they want to meet with you. The research wanted to understand 2 different things. What could you say in that 40 to 60-second gap that was most likely to make someone in the room take action? And that action might be as small as asking for your card or following you on Twitter, or as big as giving you some money or a contract or arranging a really important meeting. They also wanted to know, if we went back to the audience who heard that pitch in 3 weeks, 6 weeks and 9 weeks, what would make them most likely to have remembered you and what you said? And that being remembered thing is important, because that increases the chances they meet someone else who has the problem that you solve and tell that person about you. What they found was that 3 things were the key drivers for each of those categories. So the same 3 things that drove action were what made you memorable. They were in a different order, but they're the same 3 things. And these are great ways to increase the impact, not just of your networking messages, but also of your telephone conversations, the letters you send out, the emails you send, even what you say on Twitter. So the 3 things are: oh, no, they're not things, was testimonials. In general, we're brilliant at collecting testimonials, and we're really good at putting them on our websites. We're quite good at using them in our marketing materials, but we tend not to be great about using them verbally. So if you don't currently pepper your networking introductions with quoted testimonials from real clients about the difference that you make, then that's a great change to make. I know that in some organizations that isn't possible for various reasons, so you then want to focus on the other 2 areas, but if it is possible, it's a great place to start. Another way to increase the impact of your testimonials is to ask people better questions when you ask for them. So if you currently say to people, would you mind giving us a testimonial? Or if you currently give them a feedback form that has a comment section and draw testimonials from there, think about asking some other questions that encourage people to give you more distinctive testimonials. lots of organisations have lots of testimonials that are very similar. Think of what questions you could ask that would drill down into things that are really different about your organisation. An example I often use of this is a company that we work with in logistics, and they take freight from Manchester to France and back again. They're inherently French, they only work between France and the UK, and so to spice up their testimonials, we simply added a question that asked their clients to comment on which iconically French thing they'd compare the company to. And now they have testimonials that describe them as the champagne of freight forwarding, and testimonials which say, when we work with this company, it's like we're always wearing the yellow jersey. And those testimonials are not only distinctive and memorable and great, but also really get to the quick about what it is about that organisation, their specialism in France, that makes them really distinctive. If you can, find ways to get distinctive and specific testimonials for what you do. The second way to kapow your message is to throw in some stats and evidence. When we ask people what they think of stats and evidence, most people tell us that they think most stats are made up and that most evidence isn't credible. But if we ask people to rate the credibility of speakers, consistently we rate speakers who use stats and evidence as more credible than those that don't. Stats and evidence make us imbue a sense of credibility on the people that give us them. Now, that's not to suggest that you should just go make some stats up because people won't check them, but it is incredibly easy to find statistics for what most people do. The first way is to collect some of your own, and for those of you who have funding, you've probably got quite a lot of impacts. If you don't, or if you're a new organisation, it's amazing what statistics you can find about the sectors you work in, about the scales of the issues that you're addressing, or about what similar organisations have achieved. Those will still add credibility to your market and demonstrate the research and the importance of what you do. The third thing that was shown to improve our messages is the one I like least, but it's there in the evidence, so I'll tell you about it. We're still really impressed by names of organisations that we've heard of. So if you're funded by a big funder, or if you have clients that people will have heard of, mention them when you're speaking. Personally, I think it can feel really icky to do this, so you might not want to do it all the time. And for some organisations, we don't have clients that people will have heard of. So what do we do then? One way to get around that is to tell people why they should be interested in who we work with. I used to network with a business growth coach who would turn up, and when he turned up, he'd say, and I work with Clinigen. And I'd never heard of Clinigen. So week after week, I'd hear the same thing, and it would have no impact on me. Until the week where the same business growth coach turned up and said, I work with Clinigen. They've just been voted one of the fastest growing companies in the UK. I still didn't know who Clinigen were, but I suddenly understood why he was telling me about them and why I should be interested. Find ways to do the same for your clients. If your clients are award-winning, if you work with a local authority that makes a big difference, if you are funded by a big name funder, tell people about that and benefit from the credibility that that will give you. So just to summarise those 3 ways to increase the impact of your message. Number 1, use more testimonials, and if you can, get better, more distinctive ones. Number 2, grab some stats and evidence and use it wherever you can. And number 3, tell people about who you work with. Tell them the stories and tell them why they're of interest to the people you're talking to. Those 3 changes should make a really big difference to how people receive your message and how they remember it. That's me finished the kind of talky bit, so I'm hoping that that people might have some questions that we can answer. Julie, shall I hand back to you?
Hi, I've unmuted myself now, so you should be able to hear me.
I can.
Excellent. If people just want to spend a few minutes with any writing questions that they might have, and we can use this time now to share those with Isla. So I'll just give you all a few minutes to make sure you've got enough time to type in. Thank you very much for that, Isla. That was very informative. I know there's a few problems with the sound, but I think we've recorded it, so hopefully people can listen again to the webinar. And we'll also be able to send out the Prezi presentation so people can check back in.
Great.
Cool. I have a question, actually, whilst we're waiting for some other questions. What tips and advice would you give if you are cold calling somebody? You want to try and arrange a meeting and you want to get through to somebody, but you're held up by a gatekeeper answering the phone. How's the best way to deal with that?
Some gatekeepers are incredibly difficult in that they have kind of read into their job description that their role is to stop anybody talking to anyone. Assuming it's not one of those, there's a few things you can try. The first thing is, don't assume that your job is to give the business case to the person you eventually talk to. The gatekeeper that you talk to has the right to know that too. So when you've got a really distinctive message and a really good reason for calling, don't hold it back till you get through to the person. Tell the gatekeeper what it is you're phoning about and why. The second thing is, as far as you can, without being creepy, make friends with them, because gatekeepers can be a huge asset to you in getting your message through. And the third tip I would use is something that we call neophyte sales, but it's basically about asking for help. Very often gatekeepers will answer the phone with something like, "Hi, can I help you?" Let the answer always be yes. As humans, we're really strongly programmed to respond to requests for help. If they don't say that, feel free to say, "I'm really hoping you can help me," and ask for their help. Say, "Look, I want to speak to so-and-so, or the name I have is so-and-so. Can you tell me if they're the right person to talk to?" Tell them a bit about why you want to talk to them. It may be that they say, "Well, it's not them," but tell you something else. They often also give you really useful information, like, well, if you want to talk to Julie Nicholson, she's a very, very busy person, and actually, she never checks her email. So the best thing to do is to email it through to me. I'll put it in front of them. And that kind of help inside an organisation can actually be a really great way of getting people to talk.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Isla. We do have a couple of questions here. The first one is, my group is a hard sell. We teach people how to talk about death and we deliver bad news. Is there a softer way of getting people interested?
Yes, is the answer. There probably are lots of ways of softening that message. I would probably question whether you need to soften the message. So it goes back to the point earlier about finding the people who are your customers and researching that. Nobody particularly likes to talk about death when it's not something that is a real issue in their lives at that time. So I would arm yourself with lots of statistics and evidence about how the results of unmet and undealt with grief impact on people. Talk about who you need to talk to, when, and what difference it makes, and get some really powerful testimonials about the difference your service makes. Because that, I think, is the sell. That there are going to be people who don't need your service and they're not going to want to talk about it, but people who do need it, there are ways of getting them interested in why they should look at it differently, if that makes sense.
Great, thank you. Now, just building on that, about statistics and evidence, somebody's asked if you can actually give some more examples about the type of statistics and evidence that you should use.
Okay. in my head there's kind of a hierarchy of statistics and evidence. So at the top of the hierarchy is data from your own organisation about the impact you have. So if you have moved 200 people from long-term unemployment into employment, that's a great statistic and one that you should use. You can go further. You could look for kind of economic proxies, and you could work out how many millions of pounds worth of savings to the public purse that represents. But the pinnacle is data about the actual impact that you have. And ideally that should be verifiable data. It should be collected regularly, and it should be up to date. So you can say last year we made this difference. The next level down is to look at kind of sector type data. So for instance, if you run a furniture reuse type organisation, you might want to look at the number of those that exist in the UK, or you might want figures from the Furniture Resource Network, which talks about how many tons of furniture they divert from landfill, or how many hours of training they provide. And by placing yourself in context within that sector, you kind of gain some credibility. Likewise, if you offer a service which is an alternative to a public sector service, you might want to talk about the percentage of that service which is delivered by social enterprises as opposed to direct, that sort of statistic. And then the next level of information really is what I call problem statistics. And that's about putting your message in context. So if you know that in the area that you work, there are 4,000 teenage pregnancies a year, and your service goes some way to address that, then use those statistics to increase the sense of urgency and importance in what you do. And again, wherever you can, try and find an economic figure. There's a sort of myth that lots of these things aren't measurable. A quick Google search will usually reveal that not only are they measurable, but they have been measured. So start to put together economic proxies. And as with any kind of stats and evidence, if we think back to kind of writing essays at school and things like that, reference it, say, show your workings, say where you got the data, what you're basing it on, and whose information you're using, and source it, because all of that adds to the credibility of what you're saying.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm getting quite a few questions coming through now. We're a small startup company selling a gardening product which promotes conservation. We're having a hard time making ourselves visible in the market given our limited startup budget. Do you have any tips for building a profile and making our voice heard in an inexpensive way?
Yes, fortunately I do have some tips. For products where you want to kind of have kind of a bigger, punch above your weight, Twitter can be amazing. I was a very reluctant tweeter initially 18 months ago, but have been thoroughly proved wrong on it, in that it's worked very well for our brand. But it's a great way to connect with the people you want to talk to. So yeah, I'd invest some time in that. I'd look at the kind of the tools that are available, especially the kind of free tools that are out there to increase your impact on Twitter and other social media. And then I'm afraid I'd say hit the phones, because I do not know a better way to accelerate getting a message out there than telling the right people. Very often organisations will assume that if you're going to phone some people, you should start with the smaller organisations and work up to the big ones. My experience is that the opposite is true. So if you think that you have a product that would sell through B&Q, use LinkedIn to find out who you need to talk to and hit the phones and talk to them. You're not going to get to talk to everybody that you want to, but you may well be surprised, particularly if you use some of those asking for help, or even better, asking for advice type questions, how quickly you can get yourself in front of the right people and get them talking about what you do. Never ever be afraid to phone and try and speak to someone in a large organisation. In general, employees have more time to talk on the phone than people who are self-employed or running their own organisations. So as long as you can give them a reason why they should listen quite early on in the conversation, they usually will, and they're usually very generous with their time and ideas.